What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be brewing up a big beer. Today we're going to be making a classic German Doppelbock. This is a beer style with a really interesting history and one that I do enjoy to drink. They're strong, rich beers that have a tremendous amount of malt character to them, but also a tremendous amount of complexity. These are by no means easy beers to brew whatsoever. They involve a tremendous amount of grain, a tremendous amount of care in the fermentation, and a whole host of other things that make them relatively difficult. Doppelbocks historically were monastic beers. These were brewed by German monks. There's a little bit of a story that goes along with this in that the Doppelbock was brewed as a form of liquid bread that the monks could use to sustain themselves during fasting in the Lenten season. And given that that's around this time of year right now, it felt like it was a good time to brew a Doppelbock. Historically though, Doppelbock was not the high alcohol version of the beer that we know and see today. It was actually a lot more likely an under-attenuated beer that was very sweet and had lots of unfermented sugars in it. This allowed them to get nutrients and extra calories in them to sustain themselves without too much other food or water, whatever was allowed during that fasting period. I'm going to be targeting a very high gravity on this one. I'm going to be hoping to get around 8 to 10% alcohol out of this particular beer. It's going to take a long time to age in, and it's going to take a long time to really mature, but it'll be a lot of fun in the whole process. Now, this beer can get very complicated very fast. It's not uncommon to see a double decoction mash schedule employed during Doppelbock brewing, and that's certainly something that you can do. Now, I'm not going to be doing that. I'm going to be using Melanoid malt and a step mash to replicate that characteristic. One thing that we can't get around though is we need a ton of yeast. Not only is this lager going to be pitched cold and fermented relatively cold, it's also a very high gravity lager. Conventional wisdom says if you're brewing a lager, you automatically need to double your pitch rate. That's not 100% true, but it is true if it's a colder fermentation, which this one is. Conventional wisdom also tells you that for a high gravity beer, you also need to double your pitch rate. So we kind of get this 4x effect on the pitch rate because we're going to be fermenting a very high gravity wort at a relatively low temperature. And so we just need a ton of yeast. So I just went ahead and I brewed a whole ass beer to propagate out the yeast. And I got this great, super simple, delicious Helles lager just to get 500 plus billion cells. In fact, the grain to glass video for this particular beer is not going to be on YouTube, but it is available on my Instagram page as a reel. So check that out if you're curious about how that process went. But basically, I just turned one 200 billion cell packet of Imperial L18 goat into about 500 or 600 billion cells. And on top of that, I got 5 gallons of absolutely delicious Helles. So that's kind of a win-win. Before we get into the recipe, I just want to give a quick shout out to a couple organizations for helping make this video possible. Firstly, Northern Brewer. They provided the ingredients for this batch of beer. And secondly, Clawhammer Supply, who manufacture this system that I'll be brewing this particular beer on. In today's brew, because of the sheer volume of grain and the fact that I'm too lazy to do a double reiterated mash, I'm going to be using the 20-gallon kettle, and that's their 20-gallon 240-volt system. Their kettles come in 10 and 20-gallon sizes, as well as 120 and 240-volt configurations for whatever is your brewing need. So let's go ahead and jump into this recipe now. For starters, the grain bill is huge. It's about 19 pounds of grain for a 5-gallon batch of beer. It's a big beer, but it's by no means the biggest beer that I've made. I have a barley wine that is still aging and still conditioning, but that had about 30 pounds of grain in it. Side note, this is a pretty big beer, all things considered, so I highly recommend either working a sparge into your schedule or trying to figure out how to get a bigger mash tun to do all of this in one step. So we're going to be starting out with a base of Munich malt. Doppelbocks are deeply rich, bready beers that use Munich malt as their primary base malt. So I'm going to be starting out with 9 pounds of Weyermann Barca Munich malt. A large portion of the rest of the fermentables is going to be made up by 7 pounds of Weyermann Barca Pilsner malt. The reason for this is because while Munich malt certainly still has enough diastatic power to get the job done, adding some Pilsner malt in there is going to help significantly in aiding mash conversion and also just keeping it from being too thick and too bready. And then we're gonna add 2 pounds of Weyermann Munich 2 or dark Munich malt. This is for color and also for flavor. Dark Munich malt is rich. It's got so much character to it without being a caramel malt. It's a heavily toasted version of Munich malt that has just like really nice, dark, deep, rich, bready, crusty notes. And it's a key ingredient, especially if you're brewing a Doppelbock like this. For a little bit of complexity and sweetness, I'm gonna be adding in about half a pound of Weyermann Munich 3. Which will get us some nice like dark fruit character, maybe some raisin notes, a little bit of burned sugar character, which will all age, I think, very gracefully. We're gonna also add in 6 ounces, a little over a quarter pound of Weyermann Melanoiden malt. This is kind of the hack to get around decoction mashing this beer. So by adding in some Melanoiden malt and coupling that with a step mash, we get very similar effects. It's definitely not a 1-to-1 swap for decoction. It's gonna be a slightly different character, a little bit sweeter, but it does get you a very similar result. And last but certainly not least, I'm gonna be doing, for color adjustment, 2 ounces of Weyermann Carafa Special 3. For hops in this beer, it's incredibly simple. These are extremely malty beers. There is no purpose in the hopping regimen other than to provide some semblance of balance to the beer to prevent it from being too malty. So I am only going to be adding bittering hops into this one. I'm gonna be using only 3/4 of an ounce of Magnum at 60 minutes for a total of 21 IBUs. Keep in mind as well, this is a 2-hour boil. The reason for that is to really promote that wort condensation and getting that gravity up there. Theoretically, this could promote some kettle caramelization as well, but we want to kind of keep that to a limit because of the exposed electric element. Either way, the point is don't throw your bittering hops in at the very beginning of the boil. We're gonna be boiling for a full hour with nothing added. So once we hit that 60-minute mark, where we're halfway through the boil, then we'll add the bittering hops to get that calculated level of bitterness. For the water profile on this beer, it is set up so that we have a pretty strong, malty, full-feeling beer at the end of it. So that water profile is 51 parts per million of calcium, 8 parts per million of magnesium, 22 parts per million of sodium, 101 parts per million of chloride, 64 parts per million of sulfate, and 0 parts per million of bicarbonate. And in order to get that water profile, because of the sheer volume of the mash and because I still don't feel like sparging, I'm gonna be starting out with 9.5 gallons of reverse osmosis water and adding to that 5 grams of calcium chloride, 2 grams of sodium chloride, 3 grams of Epsom, and 2 grams of gypsum. For the yeast in this beer, I'm super excited that it timed out really, really well with Imperial's limited release for this year, which is L18 Goat. This is supposedly the Einger strain, and they have a fantastic and very famous Doppelbock called the Celebrator. The Einger Celebrator is one of the easiest Doppelbocks to find here imported in the US, and it is an excellent, excellent example. This is a very high-performing lager yeast with limited sulfur and limited ester production while still pushing the malt really, really far to the forefront. And I can tell you that even in a Helles that is 100% Pilsner malt, it gets so much more richness and maltiness in it, even more so than Imperial L17 Harvest or the Augustiner strain. If you're watching this video and you can't find Imperial L18 Goat because it's out of season or you just can't find it in general, I would recommend OYL 111 German Bock lager yeast from Omega, because that is the exact same strain. And then finally for the mash on this beer, as I said at the beginning of the video, you can and probably should do a decoction mash if you want to do this in a very traditional sense. That is something that is going to generate a lot of caramelization, and just the Maillard reactions that take place during the decoction mash give a unique character and a unique richness to a beer that is brewed using that method. This is why Czech lagers are so malty. That being said, you don't have to do this. I did a decoction mash for a Doppelbock 4 or 5 years ago. It was excellent. It really, really worked out, but it's like no joke. It is a ton of work. It is a lot of labor, and you have to really be dedicated to do that. And with my current situation, I can't do a decoction mash until it's like warm outside in the summer because I have to do it outside on propane. Because it's still winter, I can't really do that. So I am settling for that step mash plus melanoid malt technique, which is perfectly fine. It's always up to you whether or not you want to do a decoction mash. Don't let anyone tell you that you have to. So with that being said, what I'm doing for my particular brewing process is a Hochkertz style step mash with some extended rest time in there. I'm doing a 2-step mash as I usually do for my German beers, with one rest at 148 degrees and one rest at 158 degrees. Now normally I would do a half an hour at each of these steps, but because of the huge grain bill and how long it's going to take for conversion to take place, I'm going to extend these rest times out to 45 minutes each. This should still get the same effect, but just because there's so much more going on in the mash, it's going to take a bit longer for that full conversion to take place. We'll follow that up with a 15-minute mash out, and then we'll be off to the races for the boil. Guys, I am super excited for this beer, and it's one that I'm really looking forward to, and something that, you know, I think it's gonna be really nice, especially as it ages for a long period of time.
Before we even jump into the brew day, I want to talk quickly about how I propagated out the yeast and then harvested it. So as I mentioned before, I brewed a very simple Helles lager as a starter beer for this pitch. When I made this beer, I pitched in the one packet without a starter, just direct. It fermented out great, and once that fermentation was complete, I just started to collect the yeast itself. Before I even transferred the beer itself into a keg, what I did was I sanitized everything very thoroughly. I hooked up a 2-inch to 1.5-inch tri-clamp reducer to the bottom port of my conical. Then I hooked up a 90-degree elbow tube hookup, basically, on the other end of that. This allowed me to control the mess a little bit more and make it easier to precisely measure how much yeast was going to be coming out. I very gently opened the butterfly valve, only a little bit at a time, until I got a good stream of yeast and trub mixture coming out. The first stuff to come out is going to be trub mostly, and not as much yeast. So I dumped this stuff first, and then once I saw that I was getting good clean yeast cells, then I transferred it over into my thoroughly sanitized mason jar and filled it to the brim. Next, I thoroughly sanitized the lid, attaching it to the mason jar, and then actually, instead of screwing it all the way down, what I did was I tightened it and then untightened it by about a quarter turn to allow for any residual gases to escape from the yeast slurry. Next, I put it in the fridge, which allows it to kind of separate out into its individual layers. And once you do this, you'll see that you get clear beer at the top, you'll get healthy yeast cells, and then you'll get a little bit more trub layer developing at the bottom. The rule of thumb for estimating cell count in a slurry is pretty simple. It's that basically 1 milliliter of slurry has about 2 billion cells of healthy active yeast in it. So for every 100 milliliters of slurry, you get 200 billion cells. As I was targeting about 500 billion cells here, I ended up getting exactly that with 250 milliliters of healthy slurry. For the Doppelbock brew day itself, though, I started out by collecting 9.5 gallons of reverse osmosis water and then starting to heat that up to the first rest temperature of 148 degrees Fahrenheit. While this took place, I milled all of my grain, which took quite a while. I also separately milled my Carafa Special 3, as this was going to be added at the very end of the mash. And then I also measured out all my water salts and added those into the strike water as it was heating up. Once I hit my target strike temperature, I mashed in with the entire grain bill, which was not an issue for capacity given that I was using the much larger system. I got everything broken up and allowed it to sit and work its way through the mash steps. This again was 45 minutes at 148, 45 minutes at 158, and 15 minutes at 170 for a mash out. I did quickly measure my pH on this one as well, which turned out to be on target at 5.15, so I did nothing to adjust for pH in this brew. At the very end of the mash, I also added in my 2 ounces of Carafa Special 3 for color. Once the mash was complete, I pulled out the grain basket and allowed that to drain for about 15 minutes as well. I wanted to make sure I collected a good 8 gallons of wort for this one, just to give myself enough volume for that 2-hour boil. As I was collecting this wort, I also started to heat things up to the boil. Once I reached a full boil, I started a 2-hour timer. Once that first hour had passed, I came back and I added my 3/4 of an ounce of Magnum for bittering hops and allowed it to boil for another 50 minutes before adding a 10-minute addition of Whirlfloc and yeast nutrient. 10 minutes after this, I ended the boil and then I chilled in one pass through my counterflow chiller going into my Brewbuild X2. Once I got everything fully transferred over, I continued the chill in the Brewbuild X2 using its glycol jacket down to the target pitch temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit. But before we even pitched the yeast, I hooked up an oxygen tank and a carbonation stone and adequately aerated the wort with about 2 liters of pure oxygen. That's about 2 minutes of oxygen flowing at a rate of 1 liter per minute through the carb stone. Once this was completed and the temperature was verified, I pitched in my yeast slurry and allowed it to begin fermentation. At this time, I also pulled a sample for my original gravity measurement, and I found it to be on target for what I had planned, actually, which is about 1083. I expected about a 10% brewhouse efficiency loss for a high gravity beer like this, and I was right on for my estimate.
All right, so now it's time to talk about the fermentation for this beer, and just before we even get into it, please understand that this is a difficult beer to ferment. Not only is it a high gravity beer, so all of the techniques and aspects that apply to doing a successful high gravity fermentation apply, but it is also a lager, which means that there is extra emphasis on this particular beer being clean and not having any fermentation character generally at all. These two things in combination are very, very challenging. So with that in mind, let's talk about how to achieve that as best as possible. The first thing I'm going to do here is talk about yeast pitch rate. This is not only a cold temperature fermentation, which requires twice the pitch rate, but also it's a high gravity fermentation, which requires twice the pitch rate. So now we have 4 times the amount of yeast that you would otherwise be putting into a beer. For this beer, I highly encourage you to not just pitch the yeast straight out of the packet. Make a starter, right? We don't want to put $100 of yeast into the beer without getting it ready to go. In my case, I'm going to be using Imperial yeast, and they, as well as many other manufacturers now, are kind of starting to go towards higher cell counts in their packages. Keep in mind though that that is a cell count that is estimated on day 1 of getting it packaged. Over the next 6 months or so, that cell count is going to drop off. So keep in mind the age of your yeast as well. If you're making a starter, you can generally, like rule of thumb, estimate that your cell count is going to approximately double. Depending on the gravity of this beer, that may not be enough for you. So you might want to look into doing a second starter step. If you're stepping up your starter, you're increasing that level of cell count even more, which is going to therefore significantly increase your chances of a good fermentation. Or you can do what I did in this case and brew a starter beer and then harvest the yeast slurry off of that starter beer. That's going to give you several 100 billion cells of viable and well-exercised yeast that are very much up to the task. If you're able to time it such that you can take your starter beer and package that and then put your Doppelbock wort directly on top of the yeast cake, then that's even better. The point here is not only maximizing your cell count, but also maximizing the viability, or basically the percentage of those cells that are living and active, and the vitality of these cells, which means how ready they are to prepare to do this task. If your yeast have high vitality, then when you pitch them into this really high gravity wort, they're actually not going to be shocked as much, and you're going to get less off flavors that are produced from the pitching alone. So key to fermenting this beer particularly well are make sure you have at least 500 billion cells of viable yeast that are also vitalized and ready to go, and pitch them at or below your target fermentation temperature. While many lager yeasts are absolutely capable of fermenting great beer at higher temperatures, that's usually in relation to lower gravity beers like Pilsners and Helles and Märzens and stuff like that. This is not that case. The other thing we're going to need to do is make sure we talk a little bit about the oxygenation level, the aeration of the initial wort before you pitch the yeast. Again, high gravity beer, this concept applies very much so. I highly recommend using pure oxygen and a carbonation stone to deliver at least 1 to 2 liters of oxygen over the course of a minute into that wort. It's another step that just really reduces those off flavors. It reduces the stress on the yeast and gives them the best possible start to the fermentation that you can give them. You can splash it around and shake it up for a while, and it'll get you a lot less dissolved oxygen, but it will still be generally enough for the purposes of it. So just be deliberate about getting some aeration going for these high gravity beers. Don't just pitch it and walk away. So that's everything related to propagating out enough yeast and then pitching for this beer. Now let's talk about fermentation. Again, due to the gravity and the low fermentation temperature, I am fully expecting this to take a very long time. maybe like 4 to 5 weeks in primary fermentation, I'm not sure. I'm gonna be tasting this one and sampling it regularly to know when is it really getting to that level of, okay, I can package this and begin the lagering process. So key to ensuring that this goes well is, constantly monitoring the fermentation. I'll be cheating a little bit here too as well, and definitely not adhering to the Reinheitsgebot in adding ALDC enzyme. I love this stuff. There's not that many things in brewing that are magic bullets, but this is actually one of them. The ALDC enzyme reduces or completely eliminates the production of diacetyl in pretty much all yeasts out there. It is amazing. It just cuts time off of the fermentation and improves beer quality significantly. So I'm gonna be using that in my fermentation. There is nothing wrong with doing it otherwise, but it's one of those things that I just kind of recommend if you want this beer to be done quicker. So therefore, you don't really necessarily need to do a diacetyl rest at a higher temperature at the end of the fermentation. The rest of my lager process is pretty standard. Once I've finished the fermentation, I'm gonna go ahead and actually keg it. I'm gonna package it, and I'm gonna lager in the keg, and it's gonna go in the back of my kegerator where it's nice and cold, and it's gonna sit there for several weeks to a month or so, depending on how long this beer will need to mature. The duration of that is not something that I know right off the bat right now. It's really just up to how does it taste, how is it feeling, and what kind of changes are we observing along the process. It's all about documenting that and making sure you know when the peak is for the beer's flavor. And for a strong beer like this, it could be several months from now. Really quickly, we'll talk about equivalent yeasts or alternate yeasts. As I said, L18 Goat is a limited release, so if you're watching this in the future, odds are you won't find it from Imperial. So alternative yeast manufacturers for this particular strain are Omega OYL 111 German Bock, White Labs WLP 833 German Bock Lager, or Yeast 2487 PC, again another limited collection there, Hella Bock Lager. Another fantastic option of lager yeast that would make an excellent Doppelbock would be the Kloster Andex strain. This one's a lot harder to get a hold of because, to my knowledge, the only versions of it that are sold to homebrewers are actually private collections as well. But either Imperial L26 Pilgrimage or White Labs WLP 835 German X Lager are going to be that strain. And that is an even maltier, even fuller, even creamier version of this, really intense malt forward lager yeast that does a fantastic job. If you've never had the Kloster Andex Doppelbock, by the way, holy crap, that's a good beer. It's like, honestly, it is one of the best. I made a Maibock with that and that turned out fantastic. If you can't find the Einja strain that I'm using here or the Andex strain that I just mentioned, you could do a reasonable substitute with the Augustinus strain. That's going to be Imperial L17 Harvest, Omega 114 Bayern Lager, or WLP 860. Side note, WLP 860 is actually available as a dry lager yeast now, which is awesome. The Augustinus strain will attenuate the beer more. It's going to be a little bit drier, a little bit less malty. It's still going to deliver a fantastic lager, and it's one of my favorite lager strains of all time. So don't look at that like it's a bad or last-ditch option. So it's just that my taste for these Doppelbocks are strong, intense, sweet, malty beers, and you want a lager yeast that has a low attenuation level to get that effect. And that's really kind of where it's coming from my perspective, but you can absolutely make an excellent Doppelbock with the Augustinus strain as well. And that's available everywhere. For that same reason, this is one of those situations where I really would advise against using one of those Kveik pseudo lagers like Lutra or Oslo. Kveik will attenuate the crap out of your beer. You're gonna get a very dry, very less sweet finishing beer as a result of this. Kveik is very well suited for the high gravity fermentation, so that is certainly one strength, but it will chew through all those sugars, it will attenuate fully, and it may not be the sweet kind of, decadent flavor that you're looking for in a Doppelbock. So just keep that in mind. It's certainly an option, but it's just not one that I'd recommend unless you're really stuck in a hot climate with no temperature control. So just to recap, what I'm going to be doing is I am going to pitch about 500 billion cells of freshly harvested L18 goat yeast, the Einja strain. I'm going to pitch this into a wort that's been adequately aerated with pure oxygen, with about 2 liters of dissolved oxygen going into the wort before pitching. I'm going to ferment this at 55 degrees for probably about 3 to 4 weeks. I'm gonna be closely monitoring it and making sure that I'm tracking that flavor and that gravity change over time. Once I hit the tail end of fermentation, I am going to slightly raise the temperature to the low 60s. This will ensure that fermentation is completely finished and that we're going to, clean up as much as we can while we're still in the yeast cake. But once that flavor is really starting to kind of get dialed in, then I'm going to transfer it over into a keg and begin the lagering process, where I will lager this in my kegerator at close to freezing temperatures for however long it takes. It'll probably be, I'm guessing, at least 2 months of lagering at this level of alcohol. So we'll see how that goes. So thanks for coming along with me on the journey, and remember, if you're making this for yourself, pay close attention to that fermentation. It's gonna pay off later. And so I'll catch you guys in several months when it's all ready, and until then, cheers.
Fermentation for this beer surprised me. It went a lot further down than I expected in terms of attenuation, and it was also much faster than expected. The combination of a healthy pitch and a good aeration level in the wort led to a very fast fermentation, hitting our final gravity a little over a week after I pitched the yeast, which I then allowed to sit and condition. I let it sit in the fermenter for a total of about 3 weeks, and then I kegged the beer and allowed it to begin the lagering process in the keg for the next 2 months before tasting it. As most Doppelbocks have their heritage leading back to the Polaner Salvator, the original Doppelbock, they tend to pay homage to that original beer by stapling OR onto the end of every single name. And mine is no different. I'm calling mine the Terminator. It comes in at a grand total of 9.2% alcohol and 21 IBUs. For the appearance of the beer, it pours a dark ruby color, which is actually 100% crystal clear. It's just very difficult to see it due to the darkness of the beer and also due to the extreme humidity of the day in which I'm filming. The color on this beer is very similar to a Belgian quad. It's not quite brown, but it's also not quite red. It's very dark, very deep, rich red. The head that builds up is tan in color and tight in construction. It does leave good lacing, which is good to see, and a small layer stays on the surface throughout the drinking session.
All right, so now let's go in for aroma. This beer is actually a very intense aroma. First and foremost, it is really bready, like rich, dark, deep, toasty, bread crust kind of thing. It is a nice aroma that's got a lot of maltiness behind it and just a really nice, pleasant bouquet of various kinds of malts. It's got that nice, rich, freshly baked bread thing going on, but like a dark bread. Not like a white loaf, like a dark, rich, malty loaf. And then a little tiny bit of like a darker caramel note on the nose as well. So, you know, it does present very intensely on the aroma, which is pretty cool. Let's go in for mouthfeel now. With the strength of the beer like this, with the level of maltiness in there, you would expect this to be a relatively full-bodied beer, but it doesn't feel that way. It feels not light, but more like a medium body to it, but it's not full-bodied at all. It has that lager character that is very clean, light, but not really reaching that full depth of the mouthfeel that I was going for. It's a lot lighter than I think that I would have preferred. The mouthfeel on the beer is very similar to a Hellas in that it's very clean, and it's not got any smoothness, no creaminess, no roundness to it, but also no edges. It's a very medium, standard beer mouthfeel with nothing too much to write home about. But again, for the strength of this beer, it's not really at all what I was expecting, and it should be a little bit fuller than it is. All right, so now let's go in for flavor. The flavor on this one matches the aroma pretty well. Very intense, malt forward presentation. Again, that deep and rich, fresh baked bread kind of thing is going on. And then there's a little bit of like a raisin character, and then some burnt sugar, like a burned caramel characteristic. No roast at all, which is good. This is the way it should be. And no real caramel sweetness either. This is actually a relatively bitter beer compared to what I was expecting. It is well attenuated. It is rather dry feeling. And so that maltiness comes through as more of a toasty character, less of a sweet character. There's also a little tiny bit of like a sweet sherry note in here, which every time I use dark Munich malt, that seems to be one of the flavor characteristics that it has. A little hint of a sweet cherry note in there that kind of it lands on the maltier side, but still is a manifested product from, I think, the dark Munich malt. It's pretty good. It works out pretty well in this beer style. There is no alcohol hotness in this, which is awesome. For the strength of the beer and for the intensity of the fermentation, it was a very good fermentation. It's clean, it's got no yeast characteristic, it's squeaky clean, which is exactly the way that it should be. That is on point, that's what we want. But this has been lagering for 2 months now, and it's actually really coming into a peak of where the flavors are expressing themselves rather nicely. That being said, this is as good as it's going to get because there's just a few things wrong with this beer that really crippled it. This is not really what I want out of a Doppelbock. It's about 70% of what I want out of a Doppelbock. But what happened here really is that it is far too attenuated. The reason for that is that extended mash rest that I did. I thought lots of grain, lots of water, bigger recipe, it's probably gonna need more time to convert. So I extended that first rest to 45 minutes at 148 and 45 minutes at 158, right? So that was supposed to get the whole thing done, get me a good balance of fermentability and residual sugar in the beer, and it did not turn out that way. I really think that 45 minutes at 148 was more than enough for beta amylase to go through and convert most of the starches into tiny sugars, easily fermentable ones, thus leading to a little bit more attenuation than I wanted. The other side of things is it's a little over-bittered for what it is. Because it attenuated much further than I expected, the bitterness is more pronounced, and that is something that is just unfortunately a result of the way things worked. If it had been a sweeter finishing beer, I think it would have been balanced and the bitterness would have been appropriate, but in this case, it's just a little too much. I think by either doing a shorter step mash or just doing a single rest even at a higher temperature, that would have gotten a little bit more sweetness out of this beer, a little bit more body into it, which it desperately needs to back up all of that malt flavor. I think I'd also probably throw in a little bit more chloride into the water profile to get this thing a little bit more rounded and give it a little bit more beefiness to it and get that maltiness, again, pushed up. And lastly, this is probably more of a personal preference thing, but now that I have experience with the Andex lager strain, that would do very, very well in this. Very optional. I think the Angus strain is perfectly fine for this, but it is, you know, it's got a different mouthfeel to it. The Andex lager strain, again, just really hammers home that creamy, full-bodied lager kind of thing, whereas this one isn't quite doing it for me. That being said, I've always kind of been very critical of my own work, and this is no exception. I'm gonna be pretty hard on my own beers if I find flaws in them. This is not a bad beer by any stretch of the imagination. It is a perfectly acceptable beer. It's just not what I envisioned as a Doppelbock, so keep that in mind if you're looking at this recipe. The suggestions that I have are in relation to my own palate and in relation to what I want and expect out of a Doppelbock. So if you utilize those suggestions, then your beer will be sweeter, fuller, and more malty, which is what I want. But if you want a dark lager that drinks more like a Belgian quad, for example, without the yeastiness and a clean fermentation instead, this is a good recipe for it, but it's still quite enjoyable. And you know, I'm enjoying letting it sit here and mature as well. The flavors have rounded out quite a bit in the last 2 months. It's really relaxed a lot of its intensity as well. And maybe that will continue to happen over the next 2 or 3 months. And I'm sure there's somebody on here who's gonna be like, why are you tasting it so damn young? And you know, you got a point. But the thing is, like, even though it's only 2 months old, it's not going to magically gain body. It's not gonna magically gain sweetness. This is one of those beers that if I had a barrel, I'd probably age it in a barrel, and because that would certainly add a little bit of body to it. And it would also add a nice layer of complexity. And then that would be pretty cool, but I don't have a barrel, and that's not something I'm going to do. Either way, it was a fun project, but I feel like I'm kind of cursed by Doppelbocks now, because if you follow my Instagram, you saw that the first time I tried to brew this, I actually scorched the crap out of the batch, had to dump that, and I brewed it a second time, and now the second time is over attenuated and, you know, not quite 100% what it should be. Maybe there's a third Doppelbock in the future, and maybe I'll get it right then, we'll see. Either way, we live and learn. I hope this video helps you learn as well, and helps you make your own excellent Doppelbock. Learn from my mistakes and don't repeat them. As always, guys, if you want to support the channel, please consider picking up a t-shirt like this one. You can find this design, plenty of others, in my merchandise store, which is linked down in the description box below. There's a brand new merchandise store now. I have quit using Teespring because they decided just to stop shipping products. So now we're going over to Fourth Wall, and we'll see how they do. So please check out the new store. It's got some new products on there as well. I got some glassware that I'm actually really excited about because it's actually turned out to be pretty good. So if you want to support me there, it means a lot. I also have a Patreon, and my patrons are really the main source of funding for this channel. They help me so much in terms of paying for random business expenses, production equipment, cool brewing gadgets that I can share with you guys and make fun content with. The list goes on. Your support is greatly appreciated by me, so a special thanks goes out to all of you. If Patreon is not your thing, there's also the channel memberships and the super thanks button options. These also are quick and easy ways to support me. It all goes right back into the channel. I also have an Amazon store where you can find the production equipment for the channel. You can find a whole bunch of other brewing stuff on there that I recommend, and it's available on Amazon if you're curious about it, so feel free to check that out. And also, if you want to follow me on more than just YouTube, I'm on Instagram and Facebook as The Apartment Brewer, so check that out when you got some free time. You get to see what is coming to the channel in the very near or very distant future. Last but certainly not least, if you're still here, thank you very much for watching all the way to the end. This video is probably a bit of a longer one, but I hope you learned something and found it useful nonetheless. And I will catch you all in the next one. So until then, cheers.